Okay, so this is what we're considering as like the first core community call or the first Solana core developer sync. What we're kind of hoping that this turns into is a way for developers on the Solana protocol to kind of like sync on like, hey, what are changes that are being made? What are future developments that they're thinking of? What are different like, so we can also have like a SIMD process as well, like how do I propose changes on Solana, so that we can kind of more collaborate together as a whole. Ultimately, like it's up to y'all as the engineers to make up as you like best wish of what this call looks like. So yeah, in the future calls, we'll like call for an agenda if people want to put forth of what they want to talk about on the agenda side. But yeah, for the first like item and that we want to discuss is like, what do y'all think that this call should look like? And then later we'll also talk about SIMDs and what that process looks like so that we can make proposals and actually use it to make changes that and keep aligned on changes on Solana. Go ahead, Richie.
All right. Yeah, I think generally this would be mostly useful to have like an online forum where client teams can discuss changes that affect everyone. That's mainly, I guess, protocol breaking changes that Solana Labs, Jito, and Finance and so on will have to implement. But I think we should probably start with a process where we first specify something in the SIMD and then go forward. I guess other things would probably be things that actively concern mainnet and require core intervention to be fixed. I guess that would be like quality of service related incidents and so on. I think you also was there like a written agenda of or like proposal for agenda of this call? I think I saw someone something, but don't fully remember.
Yeah, for this specific call is kind of just to like one, talk about like what we both most want out of this, as well as like talk about the SIMDs, and then anything else that y'all want to bring up. Okay.
Yeah, I think just kind of this reflecting on something I've been sharing with the team internally, like, there's been a lot of calls from the calls for action from the side of the community for what I see as like more people wanting, I'll say, like read access and then write access for the Solana protocol, right? Read access being there's a lot of teams, core devs and non-core devs that want better visibility into like, hey, what's coming down the line, right? How is this going to impact me, particularly like RPC operators or dApp developers that are going to be impacted by any breaking changes and things like that. And so like that I think maybe doesn't need to be like in scope for this call, either today's or in general. But I mean, it's something that as the core developer community, like I think we can do a better job of communicating like, hey, what's like, obviously engineering roadmaps for a technology like this are incredibly difficult to nail down. And I think people understand that, but figuring out a way like as a community, or maybe it's more like as an organization, labs or foundation to like put out, more visibility to the broader community. And then as far as, right access, right? Who can make contributions or rather, how does one go about making contributions? By engaging here, making an informal proposal in Discord or in some other forum, followed by, getting feedback here or in, SIMD comment threads or anything like that. And then kind of trying to figure out what does that sort of approval process look like, and, should anyone really be owning an approval process when sure anyone can build from source and run a client with whatever changes they desire. So just sort of like trying to feel out what people think is best there, and then as we go on, like to be able to kind of dig into the actual details of like, okay, what do people actually feel about this particular proposal or that code change, etc.
Cool. And then to kind of like further jumpstart like the conversation, I'll drop in the chat the SIMDs that we currently have or that we're working on. So we recently kind of launched this process of like how we can propose protocol changes to Solana of like that would be breaking changes or like something that's a big change like economic wise. And what we can do is like everybody here can create a proposal that will change how Solana works. And then we can use this to discuss how a different change works, how it affects all of us, especially between like Firedancer, Jito, and then like working with the Mango folks, like how we can create or keep in line of the big changes coming on Solana in the future, especially when they're like feature activations. Like how do we do that across teams, et cetera?
So I'm just going to say a bunch of things that are kind of in the space, and some of this are things that we also discussed with Dan a little bit earlier. And I think a lot of this is just related to work going on internally and how we've thought about a lot of these problems. None of this is anything I have really prepared remarks on or anything, but one of the things that already exists in this, we talked about specs, is part of our job is to, essentially come up with specs for what the existing protocol is from the current code. And there has been some repos set up in places like the Solana Foundation. I know there's a lot of kind of comments on that. And, that's also somewhat a prerequisite for work we're doing internally, where we've engaged with various experts in formal verification and whatnot. And it's very difficult to formal verify if we don't actually have a spec for doing that. So, so at least from the kind of specs repo, read, write, access and whatnot, I'd kind of direct things in that direction unless there's a broad consensus of the community who we don't want to have those, but I don't really see that as not being an option for long term if we want to have multiple validators or whatnot, and kind of put people in that direction. I think when it comes down to those, that's not the only repo. Like there's the internal repos that we're developing. There's obviously the Solana Labs repos, other people's repos that are kind of sitting around here. We spent a lot of time in the initial discussion when we were asked to look in this area as to what was the right model for doing the engagement. And we were deathly afraid that we had, two different organizations, different cultures, different development styles, different languages and all that, that if we were to try to do stuff in the same repo, it'd be disastrous. And it wasn't just that, kind of abstract concern. Internally, Jump has a lot of, internal communities with the various trading groups and so on and so forth. And, doing everything in a common repo just tends not to work. So we've done a lot of stuff internally just for, non-crypto related things where we essentially develop stuff at boundaries between repos and come up with interfaces, be they shared memory interfaces or whatnot. And so like a lot of the stuff that we've been planning on here is to essentially iterate independently in our own repo, let Solana iterate in their repo, use the specs that we're doing to essentially define boundaries, both for how the protocol works, but also ways that we can divide stuff up and componentize the existing validator and then swap out various parts as we go and do that. And a lot of that is being done at process boundaries, so we don't have to have a whole lot of friction or tight integration between organizations and those kind of logistical problems that can do. With respect to protocol breaking changes, as we've been going through a lot of stuff and checking more stuff in, we have a lot of ideas and we've spent a lot of time thinking about how we might bring them to the community. I think one of the things that already exists that we were planning on is we do have some scope in our development plan for essentially doing proof of concept designs. And like some of the stuff that we were thinking about doing is just like, we'll set up a proof of concept over here to essentially come up with reference implementation and then bring that to a community, as opposed to just having an open-ended abstract discussion to the effect like, we don't like this, maybe we could do it this way, then have everyone just be kind of like, well, it's not obvious that'll be better or not. And so at least as far as protocol breaking changes, our at least intent is we would make recommendations, but only make those recommendations after we had some working code to show how those things work. Sorry for a bunch of rant. I don't know if that's necessarily addresses the points that you mentioned, but I think it's things I was making notes on as people were talking.
I think we can take a lot of inspiration from the Ethereum process, because that has proven to work quite well at scale. And the way they do it is fairly similar. So for any non-trivial change to the specifications and whatnot, usually when you check in an EIP, or in our case an SIMD, you also have a proof of concept in your own repo, and then at least start to think ahead how another team might implement that.
Yeah, I think in my mind, I see like the bar for actually getting a SIMD merged should be quite high. I see that as like the tail end of you know, the sloppier, less formal sort of debate process, people, you know, testing things, trying to figure out what's, you know, what makes the most sense, do the prototyping, you know, and get some sort of initial like social consensus from, you know, the validators, the developer community, that like, hey, this idea, like, not only do we think it's a good idea, but like someone on the team is willing to go ahead and implement it, right? If Solana Labs, you know, thinks some SIMD is great, but FireDancer team thinks some SIMD is, you know, the same SIMD is a terrible idea, and each client, you know, in the future has 50% of the stake on the network, well, both teams need to implement it in order for it to actually, right, come to fruition. And so yeah, I agree with your proposal, Richie, on having the proof of concept. You know, and I guess I would just want to call out, like, not like as we're kind of discovering it, not to like jump to a SIMD, you know, for any random new idea, right? I think like this kind of forum stuff in Discord, GitHub issues, like, is more appropriate, where people are trying to suss out interest and feasibility of a new process.
As much as I don't want to belabor the point, the Ethereum community does check in a lot of EIPs that are never actually deployed on mainnet. It's more as to having some sort of proposed standard when you get to implementing the idea, but often you have something sitting around for 3 years, and then you might implement it at some point in the future. There's lots of different branches of these implementations, but I think if we restrict ourselves to saying anything that's an accepted SIMD will eventually be implemented and activated, then a lot of this political discussion, I think, will actually prevent the engineering efforts of standing up a proof of concept. So it's, I would maybe have less restrictions, and then say, well, this is like maybe not accepted standard, but at least it's checked in and it's there if someone wants to implement it.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm not crazy about the idea of having like a SIMD repo of like a boneyard, become like a boneyard of unimplemented proposals. Right. So there needs to be some kind of filtering mechanism. You know, but I agree, like we can have a spec or a proposal that everyone agrees is a good idea and is going to take 12 months of work, or there's just, you know, more urgent issues to be addressed, you know, sooner. So there's some middle ground there.
The problem with those like long ideas is that they usually die, or like by the time you get around to building them, something has changed to where they're no longer valid. So like I think I would prefer that the specs that do get checked in have like a path to implementation within 6 months.
To take from Ethereum as well, I believe what they have is they change, like if there's a certain point where it can't be implemented due to a number of changes that happened previously. Like, for example, if it took 6 months to implement and things changed, it's no longer a viable option. They do change in like the status to stagnant, and they kind of just throw it out at that point.
How are we like marking statuses? Is there like a mechanism for this?
Okay, yeah, so there's kind of like a process as outlined in like the first SIMD of like what you do is you draft it, so you'll be just in draft phase, and then you kind of like work with people trying to get like consensus on the actual, like, should we move forward with this, should we not, and then like once you get like that consensus, you can move into like accepted, but get to implementation phase requires like process around like feature activation, or whether or not like who who's owning the different feature activation in each client, things like that. It's like, okay, who's building the feature? What's the status of it? And how do we get it to actual activation across the network?
I guess this begs the question, who actually gets to decide to press the merge button and define what consensus is? I think for now it's perfectly valid if Solana Labs and Solana Foundation have this authority, since I guess for the exception of Jito, we're just starting out hitting mainnet. But in the long term, it would be nice to maybe define a set of people. I know this always tends to be exclude people, but I would maybe define consensus like there is no big agreement. There's like a general, acceptance of a change, even if it's not a direct confirmation from each team.
Yeah, as part of the first SIMD, it's like, hey, there's just no like obvious like outspoken disagreement, and that there is agreement from what it seems like the majority of core contributors. You can move forward on like who has access to do write or triage or maintain the repo of SIMDs. I did write up a kind of like an access policy that is very similar to like how Mozilla does it, and how they like give access to write or to triage different issues. So that is under review and up for review, so that like we can create that list of possible like merge access people. And it's both like, it's both a social consensus as well as like a technical consensus. And so like if someone abuses that power, it can easily be taken away as well.
I think there's maybe also been some questions like, and tell me if you think this is off in the weeds or out of scope here, but I think it's good for us to kind of like feel out, what these kind of processes feel right here. But I think there's also a lot of less process heavy and more just sort of navigating the space questions. Some folks have come up with just like, hey, like, I want to, like, I have this PR open against, say, the Solana Labs repo, right? Because I'd like to fix a bug or I want to make a change, whether it's a small thing or a bigger thing, but, they're a community member, or maybe it's someone from Jito wants to, push something back to Labs. Maybe it doesn't require a SIMD because it's just not a protocol thing. I'm curious, maybe Anatoly or someone from the Labs team who's on the call, like, do you guys have a sense, either written or informal, of sort of like, I know that like the quality has been very mixed, right, over time, because anyone can open a PR against the repo. Like, how does the Labs team view, receiving and merging changes?
I think if it has like a feature activation, it should probably have an associated proposal, because the feature activation implies that there is something breaking in the client, that it's not like a change you can easily roll in, and it should probably be it definitely needs to be communicated to all the FireDancer client and we should use like the proposal process for that.
Meaning anything that requires feature activation should have a corresponding SIMD.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good.
What do you think about like the changes that we've made to the validator, where they're not necessarily related to consensus, but they are like pretty significant changes?
I would love to have like a proposal to, these are the API hooks that you guys need, that for all conforming clients to implement. And then like the FireDancer team and us, we can just conform to that standard. Like, these are the hooks that Jito needs, and this is how we load. Like, I really want to load a dynamic shared object instead of like downloading a separate Jito client.
Yeah. Same. Okay, cool.
I think Richie and Kevin on FireDancer had a kind of similar plans, is that right? To basically kind of design or spec out these interfaces that aren't necessarily protocol defining, but it's just more of like an implementation detail.
Yeah,
but
those are definitely fresh on our mind as we're getting very, very close to getting the last bits of plumbing put together on our end. And I think the big things, you know, I'm going to answer this maybe more mechanically, because there's different ways you could, you know, approach this from a process standpoint or what it means from a repo standpoint. But our intent is to take the existing validator at Solana and do all the plumbing that's needed on that side to interface with our component one. And we already have basically those points where we want to go and how to do those boundaries and whatnot. And then just like proof of concept, like work it out and say, okay, we worked it out. And then essentially kick that to you guys to then say, what is a proper way to do that? And I think part of the call here is getting some idea what those processes are. Now, since that wouldn't be something that'd be a protocol breaking change or whatnot, doesn't sound like there's a SIMD involved, but we'd say, you know, here are some changes. We'd like those to go in. We'd like that to be respected kind of going forward. That defines those internal API hooks. Those API hooks, then, you know, any other organization, Jito or whatnot, could go ahead and then be using those for doing their development against two, and they could, you know, interface at those points. We also are trying to minimize the complexity and the surface area of those interfaces, so we aren't too particular about it. So if we get it wrong, or, you know, somebody wants some other kind of change on that, it's not that big a change. We're not trying to find the max cut and create the most complex, you know, interfaces across. We're trying to find very, very minimal points to simplify this kind of organizational interfacing that we're talking about here.
I remember as part of the 3 repos we created for, you know, these inter-client local APIs, there was first of all these specs, the SIMD, but there's also a validated APIs repo that Solana Foundation created. And that originally that was the plan, to have all the like C structure definitions and so on hosted there. But I think this can quickly get quite complicated if that needs to be compatible with like 3 different CI processes and build systems and so on. So I'm not too sure what the best path forward would be here. Maybe we just copy headers between clients and socially ensure that they don't get out of sync instead of using any complicated tools.
Yeah, I'm happy to you know, remove that validator internal API repo. It hasn't seen any activity since we kind of kicked that idea around a while ago. Because it's really not, like you said, it's not a protocol definition thing. It's more of a implementation for convenience between multiple teams.
And then a question for like the specs. So whenever we have like a SIMD proposed and it's accepted, for updating the specs, do y'all want to wait until after like it's actually implemented across the different clients, or do you, like when does the specs change in accordance to like upgrades to the network?
I mean, as far as I can tell, SIMDs are proposed changes and specs are authoritative sources of what the protocol actually is. And merging that before and anything is activated on mainnet is, I guess, technically wrong, but I don't know if we want to split hairs here. It's hard to tell, but I would like when it's clear that a feature is about to be activated, I think that's a good point when we want to merge things into the specs repo.
Okay, so we're coming up a little bit on time for this call anyways. So I guess for future calls, what we'll do is we will kind of like put out calls for agenda items. Future could be including like an SIMD that someone proposed, or like, hey, we're kind of talking about changing this in the validator client, the restructure, what do you all think about? So we'll do that for the new year. But yeah, is there anything else that people want to bring up before the end here?
Yeah, another thing that would be good on these calls, let me know if you guys agree, is like having a spotlight for like large changes that have been merged in. And kind of, yeah, spotlighting that, maybe just like giving a brief overview of what happened there.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
Yeah, I wonder, I'm just thinking, because like that's a topic that I think a larger audience than the speakers on this call might be interested in. Right. So it might, like, this is sort of what I was going back to earlier, right? Like there's more people than the core devs that are interested in, you know, I'll say read access to how new changes are coming in. This would certainly be a good forum to spotlight I'll say like a debate or discussion on said content. But I'm wondering if like the initial presentation could be like a, a separate thing that's like, put out to the public, and then we say, hey, on, this core dev call, we're gonna, pick it apart or provide feedback or whatever. I'm just thinking based on the number of people here and, number of opinions that I'm sure could be voiced, we will want to make space for the debate, right? Because a presentation could just be like, hey, I like recorded this 30-minute thing, deliver it to the public, and then we have a review period after.
I have a point probably for the next call, and it's to design a process for security patches, which I think is quite tricky.
What do you mean for security patches? Like 0 days?
Yeah, at the moment we don't have a really structured way to deal with GitHub security issues. It's always like situational. Sometimes we patch them immediately, sometimes we feature gate them, sometimes we try to hide them, sometimes we are really obvious about them. It's total chaos.
Yeah, the top validators should all be building from source, and we should be able to send them the patch directly in an emergency, like, so it doesn't need to be revealed in the GitHub repo.
Yeah,
And
like I
you,
said, we
right,
probably
and
want some sort of more structured process that everybody on the core and team is aware of.
there's like two kinds of attacks, right? Like one is a like one is a safety issue, and those you can get out as a patch to the top 33% of the validators. So if that is exploited, the network halts. The liveness ones are harder because you need 2/3 to upgrade, and that requires like basically a general release. So that one is really hard for us to get 2/3 of the validators to upgrade via like a secret patch, right? Like, so that has to go through, I think, the general release process.
Yeah, and at that point it would be now in this category of SIMDs, because that is probably also tied to a feature activation. That's why I brought it up.
Yeah, if there's a liveness issue that needs a feature activation, it's just like really unfortunate.
I do think for the first category though, there's an opportunity to really improve the ad hoc process that we have. So that's, I think talking about that would be good at some point.
I really do want to get the Finance client to a point where it can continue the chain without having 2/3 vote. I think you can probably optimistically confirm without finalizing. That would probably relax some of the like emergency patching that we hopefully don't have to do. I also think we should definitely fast track the SIMD process and not be held up by approvals or things like that. If there's a very obvious change, I think that can be both implemented on like the 2 or 3 clients we currently have without having to put the rubber stamp on it.
Yep.
All right, cool. So what we'll do is for the future call coming in up in the new year, we'll grab all this information from y'all and kind of work with y'all to figure out what the full agenda is, and then we'll just go through it each time. And feel free to give either me or anybody feedback on the call, like, hey, do we need this? Do you want to continue it? Like, how could we make it better? We're more than happy to like help facilitate that and help y'all work together as developers on the Solana protocol. All right, cool. Thank you, everyone, for coming today.
Thanks, everybody. Looking forward to figuring all this out. Hope everyone has a great new year.
Good. Happy New Year. Thank you.
See you guys.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jacob.